The wind howled through the trees as Ayana parked the worn-down car outside the house, its wooden structure looming ahead, silhouetted against the setting sun. The house was old, but it was all she could afford. After her husband's sudden death, the bills piled up, and Ayana was forced to sell their home and start over. She needed a place to call their own, a fresh start for her and her teenage son, Elijah. "Here we are," she said softly, her voice filled with a mix of hope and unease. Elijah, his headphones still on, barely looked up from his phone as he trudged out of the car. He had grown distant since his father passed, and moving to a new house didn't seem to improve his mood. Ayana didn't blame him. She knew this wasn't the ideal situation, but she was determined to make the best of it. This was their home now, and she'd do whatever it took to give Elijah a good life. She had always been the strong one, the provider, the protector. She didn't know how she'd manage to get through the months ahead, but she was ready to face whatever came their way. The house was more than just a shelter, it was a lifeline. But there was something strange about it. Something that didn't sit right with her. The eerie silence that surrounded it, the way it seemed to sag under the weight of its years, it all made Ayana feel uneasy. She ignored the feeling, telling herself it was just the stress of the move, the unfamiliarity. She focused instead on Elijah, who was dragging his feet as he made his way toward the door. "Come on, Elijah," she said, trying to sound cheerful. "Let's go check out your new room." He didn't respond, but Ayana could tell he was struggling. She hoped that once he settled in, he'd warm up to the idea of their new life here. She couldn't afford to dwell on the doubts in her mind, there was too much at stake. The front door creaked open, and Ayana stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dimly lit foyer. It smelled musty, like old wood and forgotten memories. The walls, once white, were now a faded yellow, and the floorboards creaked beneath her weight. The house was old, too old, maybe, but it had character. And that was enough for her. Elijah followed her inside, his gaze shifting from one room to the next as if he were looking for something, anything, to anchor him in this new space. He was so different now. The bright, curious child she had known had given way to a quiet, withdrawn teenager who rarely smiled anymore. "Mom, this place feels weird," Elijah muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayana glanced back at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. It's just. I don't know. It's like the house is watching us." Ayana chuckled softly, though there was a tinge of nervousness in her laugh. "It's just an old house, Elijah. It'll take some getting used to, but you'll see. Once we get settled in, it'll feel like home." But even as she said it, she didn't believe her own words. Something about the house made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the creaking of the floorboards or the strange chill that seemed to hang in the air, despite the warmth outside. There was something else, something dark that lingered just beneath the surface. Ayana couldn't shake the feeling that this house was hiding secrets, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to know what they were. That night, after unpacking what little they had brought with them, Ayana tucked Elijah into bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He didn't protest. He never did anymore. "Good night, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his temple. "We're going to be okay." Elijah muttered something unintelligible, but Ayana didn't push. She quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. The house felt colder now, the silence almost oppressive. As Ayana made her way down the hall, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, feeling an odd sense of being watched. Her heart raced as she reached the living room. She shook her head, dismissing the thoughts as ridiculous. It was just the stress, the unfamiliarity. She wasn't afraid. She had been through too much to let a house scare her. But the unsettling feeling remained, gnawing at the edges of her mind, refusing to let go. The first few days in the house were peaceful, at least on the surface. Ayana threw herself into unpacking, organizing their meager belongings, trying to make the house feel less cold and more like home. Elijah stayed in his room for the most part, his headphones clamped tightly to his ears, isolating himself more than ever. It was clear that moving here hadn't improved his mood. But Ayana was used to it. She knew he needed time, and she was patient. But that patience was tested on the fourth night. It started with a sound, soft, almost like a whispering. Ayana had just settled in on the couch after another long day of sorting through boxes when she heard it. A faint scratching, like fingernails against wood. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, insistent, as if something, or someone, was trying to get her attention. Ayana's heart raced as she stood up and walked cautiously toward the source of the noise, Elijah's room. "Elijah," she called softly, her voice thick with concern. She knocked gently on his door, but when there was no response, she slowly pushed it open. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the moon filtering through the blinds. Elijah was standing in front of the window, his back to her. He wasn't moving. "Elijah?" Ayana repeated, her voice edged with worry. He didn't answer, didn't even turn to look at her. Ayana stepped closer, her steps tentative, the air in the room heavy with tension. She reached out and touched his shoulder, and when he turned to face her, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were wide, but they weren't just wide, they were filled with fear, terror. The kind of fear she hadn't seen in him since his father's death. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. "I can't sleep. I keep hearing things." Ayana's heart ached. She knelt down beside him, brushing a hand through his hair. "It's okay. You're just adjusting. I know it's scary, but we're going to get through this together." But even as she spoke, Ayana's own fear began to creep in. The house had always felt off, but now, with Elijah's distress, the feeling seemed to intensify. She tried to brush it aside. There was no reason to believe anything supernatural was at play. But the sounds, the whispers, they were real. Ayana didn't know how to explain it, but she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. She glanced around the room, the shadows in the corners seeming to stretch and writhe, just beyond her sight. Something was here, something that wanted them both to leave. She pulled Elijah close to her, holding him tight. "We're safe. We're together, and nothing is going to hurt us," she whispered, but even as she said it, she knew she was trying to convince herself just as much as him. That night, Ayana stayed in Elijah's room, curling up on the floor beside his bed, trying to keep the nightmares at bay for both of them. But sleep didn't come easy for either of them. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made Ayana's heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, alive with something malevolent. The next day, things only seemed to get worse. Ayana went to the local library in search of some answers. She needed to know if anyone else in the town had experienced strange occurrences in their homes. It wasn't that she believed in ghosts or spirits, not yet, anyway, but the unease was growing, and she needed something to explain it. She walked up to the librarian, an older woman with a stern face and glasses perched on the end of her nose. Ayana tried to keep her voice steady as she asked, "Have there been any reports of unusual events around the neighborhood? Strange things happening in the houses here?" The librarian's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, Ayana thought she saw a flicker of something dark in her eyes. "You're living on 34th Street, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice low and almost a whisper. Ayana nodded, her stomach tightening. "Yes, why?" The librarian hesitated before speaking again, glancing around as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "You should be careful. The house you're in, it's not just old. It has a history. A dark one." Ayana's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What happened there?" The librarian looked around once more, then leaned in closer. The previous owner, a man named Mr. Aldridge, well, he wasn't exactly a friendly person. He had a reputation for being cruel. And when he died, things started happening. People around here say the house is cursed. Ayana's mind raced, trying to process the information. Cursed. The librarian nodded. It said that anyone who lives there will be haunted by the spirits of those who suffered in that house. People who lived there before you, they've all left. No one stays long. Ayana felt a cold chill run down her spine. She had been hoping for answers, but this wasn't what she expected. As she made her way back to the house, her thoughts were consumed with the words of the librarian. A cursed house. A dark history. It was all starting to make sense, but it also felt like too much to believe. When she arrived home, she found Elijah sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. His expression was vacant, almost as if he weren't really there. Elijah, she called softly, but he didn't respond. Her heart skipped a beat as she moved closer to him. That's when she saw it, something had changed in him. His eyes were wide, unblinking, his face pale. Elijah, she whispered, shaking his shoulder. What's going on? He slowly turned to her, his lips barely moving as he whispered, It's here, Mom. It's here. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive, and Ayana's heart began to pound in her chest. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was coming for them. Ayana couldn't shake the sense of dread that hung over her. Elijah's eyes were wide with terror, and his voice, though barely audible, sent chills through her spine. It's here, Mom. It's here. For the first time since moving into this old house, Ayana couldn't ignore the feeling that something far more sinister than her own imagination was at play. Her own instincts screamed at her to leave, to run far away with Elijah. But where would they go? How could she leave everything behind again? After all, she had just fought to give him a fresh start. Her thoughts were interrupted when Elijah suddenly stood up, his movements stiff, like he was being controlled by something unseen. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Ayana rushed toward him, panic clawing at her throat. Elijah! Snap out of it! She shook him harder, but he didn't respond. A strange, cold laugh echoed from somewhere deep within the house. The walls seemed to close in, the air becoming thick with an unseen presence. Ayana turned toward the door, desperate to find an answer. Why is this happening? The next morning, after a night filled with restless tossing and turning, Ayana took Elijah to school, though it was clear that neither of them was truly present. Elijah had grown quieter since the night before. His silence was disturbing. As they drove through town, Ayana's mind replayed the librarian's words. You should be careful. The house you're in, it has a history. A dark one. The librarian's warning echoed in her mind as she dropped Elijah off at school. She could feel the weight of those words sinking into her chest. The house wasn't just old and abandoned, it was cursed. The thought seemed absurd, but Ayana knew that something in this town wasn't right. Once Elijah was safely inside, Ayana returned to the library. She needed more information. She had to find out everything she could about the house's past. The librarian was the only one who had offered her any clue, but Ayana wasn't going to stop there. She needed hard facts, the kind that could explain what was happening to her son. When she entered the library, she found the same librarian sitting behind the desk, reading a book with half-moon glasses perched on her nose. Ayana approached her, trying to calm the nervous energy that was building inside her. Excuse me, Ayana said, her voice shaking. I need to know more about the house on 34th Street. Can you tell me anything about its previous owners? Anything unusual? The librarian's eyes flickered up from the book, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Ayana could see the hesitation in her eyes, but when the librarian finally spoke, it was in a low, almost hesitant tone. Mr. Aldrich was the last owner, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He was a private man, and no one really knew much about him. But the things he did in that house, well, they weren't the sort of things a man like him should have done. Ayana leaned in, her heart pounding in her chest. What do you mean? The librarian glanced around nervously before continuing. Mr. Aldrich was cruel. He didn't just work with people in the town, he controlled them. People say he dabbled in things that weren't meant to be dabbled in. The house, it became something else under his ownership. It started to change, people started disappearing. Neighbors reported strange noises, lights flickering, whispers in the wind, but the worst of it came after Mr. Aldrich passed. Ayana's stomach churned with unease as the librarian's words sank in. What happened after he died? The house, it kept going, the librarian said, her voice barely a whisper now. There were reports of strange activity. People said that Mr. Aldrich's spirit never left. He was trapped in that house, and it seemed like he was trying to drag others with him. Ayana took a step back, stunned. What do you mean, drag others with him? The librarian shook her head. No one who has lived in that house has stayed for long. Each of them, one by one, has fled, leaving everything behind. Some say it's because they saw things, heard things, they couldn't explain. Others say it was the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. Ayana's thoughts raced. This wasn't just a random haunting, it was a curse bound to the house and its previous owner, Mr. Aldrich. She had to know more, had to understand what was happening to Elijah. There had to be a way to stop this, to protect him. Before Ayana could ask more questions, the librarian leaned forward, her voice trembling. There's one more thing, though. Mr. Aldrich didn't die quietly. He made a pact, with something dark. And that pact is what keeps the house cursed. If you want to stop it, you have to break the pact. Ayana's heart stopped. Break the pact. The librarian nodded. The pact can only be broken by someone who is willing to sacrifice something dear to them, something irreplaceable. If you want to protect your son, you'll have to be prepared to lose something. But remember, breaking the pact isn't easy. If you fail, the house will take what it wants. Ayana felt the weight of the librarian's words crush her chest. Sacrifice something dear to her. The thought made her stomach twist. But if that's what it would take to save Elijah, she would do anything. She thanked the librarian quickly and rushed out of the library. The pressure was building inside her, she couldn't let Elijah suffer any longer. There had to be a way to stop this. She just had to figure out what the pact was and how to break it before it was too late. When Ayana got home, the house felt different. The air was thick with tension, oppressive and cold. She entered cautiously, calling out for Elijah. But there was no answer. The silence was deafening. Ayana's heart pounded as she searched the house. She found him in his room, sitting motionless on the bed, staring at the wall. His eyes were vacant, lost. Ayana rushed to his side, desperate to snap him out of it. Elijah, please, talk to me. But as she touched his shoulder, she froze. Something was wrong. His body was ice cold, and his skin felt unnatural, as though something inhuman was gripping him. Her voice broke as she whispered, Elijah, what's happening to you? The only answer was a soft, chilling whisper from the darkness around them. A voice that wasn't his. You're mine now, just like the others. You can't escape. Ayana's heart raced as she held Elijah's cold, lifeless body in her arms. She could hear the whispers again, the same chilling words that had followed her ever since moving into this cursed house. You're mine now, just like the others. You can't escape. Her mind was clouded with panic, but one thought kept cutting through it all, she had to save Elijah. She couldn't lose him. Not to this. Please, Elijah. Please, wake up, Ayana whispered desperately, shaking his shoulders gently. His face remained eerily still, his once warm eyes now hollow and vacant. She could feel the dark presence creeping closer, like a shadow that consumed everything in its path. Ayana stood up, clutching Elijah close to her chest, her breathing ragged. Her mind raced for a solution. The librarian had spoken of a pact. A dark deal Mr. Aldrich had made with something that had bound the house, and its horrors, to the very fabric of reality. If she wanted to protect her son, she had to break that pact. But how?